Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is a fairly brief game from the 2011 FIDE World Cup knockout between Ruslan Ponomariov and Nh2. These guys had to take it into a playoff system with rapid time controls in order to see who would advance in the tournament. Ponomariov with the white pieces in this game opened with one e4, and we have the French defense e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6, and now e5, Steinitz variation, kicking that knight back. After knight on c to e2, this is the first curious looking move, we have c5. So what exactly is going on with that knight move? Well, in chess, typically you're going to not want to move the same piece more than once in the opening. So what is this move's intention? Well, we see that right away. After c5, we're now able to, as white, play c3, lend support to our d4 square, which is going to be an important point to watch over. If we're not able to maintain a pawn on d4, we would then have to be watching out for our e5 pawn. So white is taking steps, in other words, to just secure that d4 square. So knight c6, hard to argue a better square for the queen knight. This is often the case in the French defense. That knight is going to be played to c6, exerting strong pressure against both d4 and e5. In many instances in the French, you will also see f6, trying to crack at that lead pawn for white on e5. So more development, knight f3, bishop e7, and now a3. What exactly is going on with that move? Well, first and foremost, what white is looking to do is potentially advance b4. Now, why is that a big deal? Well, let's see why. So let's assume black makes a very routine-like move of castle. If white now plays b4, there's a serious question being placed to c5. This pawn has to make a decision, has to capture, has to move forward, or maybe even black has to support it with b6. So certainly a decision has to be made now with this pawn, but not only that. In addition to those reasons, this pawn, since it's now established on b4, at any moment it could press forward again, and this knight is probably not going to be too happy because it's going to have to now find a new home, and I'm not so sure there's a better home for a knight, or this particular knight, than on c6. Again, exerting pressure on these two squares right here is going to be of great importance. So black stops this idea altogether with a5. So a3 is now met with a5. And so one question you may have at this point is, well, if white makes this a3 move and black can simply stop that idea with a5, why was that move even played? What was its purpose? Well, there is an additional purpose to this a3 move, and it's just to watch over this b4 square, because your c3 pawn is not always going to be in a position to watch over b4. At any moment, for example, let's just say white plays knight g3. At any moment, black could capture, and this pawn wants to be able to recapture. That was the intention very early on of moving this knight to e2, to allow that pawn to advance. So in the event there is a capture, white can recapture with the pawn. So what I'm getting at is this pawn, as soon as it captures towards the center, b4 would no longer be defended. But fortunately, a3 is now there in order to watch over b4, which is a very important square to watch over, because the knight or bishop could potentially make use of that square. So there are multiple reasons behind this simple pawn advance, and we saw those reasons right now. So a5, knight f4, a very aggressive square for the knight. Pressure on the black pieces, potentially looking to go to h5, but its primary purpose, clear the way for this light square bishop to develop. So a4, locking down on that b3 square so that there's this maneuver. The knight could eventually pivot on b6, land on c4, and not have to worry about being kicked away with b3. If b3 ever comes, black could always capture. In addition to that, a3 is also vacated. Maybe down the line this knight would want to pivot on a5. So moving forward, we have bishop d3. Hard to argue a better diagonal for the bishop, bearing down against the eventual black king side, namely h7. There is, of course, e2, d3. e2 doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not like there's going to be a bishop coming out and causing you some annoying pin. So certainly d3 is best. Knight on b6, looking to get to c4. White castles, black castles, and now h4. h4 is securing that g5 square so that there's a knight move to that g5 square. And in fact, as a result of this last move, this bishop, you could now say, is overloaded. this bishop now has two roles. It has to stay in a position now where if white captures on c5, it wants to be able to, let's say, recapture. And if the white knight makes use of that g5 square, the bishop wants to be able to take it out. And so if, let's say, black plays a developing move, which isn't really doing a whole lot beyond just getting a piece off of the back rank, if white now captures on c5, this bishop is being lured away from control of that g5 square. And so now white is now able to implement that Greek gift sacrifice, starting with bishop takes on h7, king takes, knight check, king goes back, and now the queen comes out, and mate is coming very soon. Threat of queen h7 is mate. There's no running away. Rook move would just allow mate in two, starting first with queen takes, pawn check, king in the corner, and a nice finish would be that knight g6, and that's a nice smothered mate. So that's certainly not going to happen, but h4, again, is essentially making black decide what they want to do with this pawn. So black actually resolves the tension right now at this point. C takes D, and now knight to c4. You'll note, instead of knight to c4, black could go forward with maybe capturing on h4, but probably discounted that for the following reasons. If bishop takes, we could have, let's say, knight takes. There are other moves as well, but just showing you this one variation. After the queen recaptures in, let's say, g3, queen goes back. At some point, we could eventually see king g2 and rook to h1. And even though white is down a pawn, certainly there is compensation in the form of a half-open h-file. Taking an h-pawn would allow the white rooks to potentially show themselves. In addition to that, there's also maybe even a strong move starting with knight to h5, looking at these 2 points in the black position. You'll also note that white really wouldn't have to worry of knight takes pawn, not because of a counter sacrifice on h7, but rather bishop to e3, simply winning material. Both of these knights, the one on d4 hit directly, b6 indirectly. So instead of this, we don't have bishop takes pawn in this position, but rather knight to c4. The soft point in the white position is this c4 square. After g3, securing this pawn, and also maybe given time, king g2s, rook h1s, maybe knight is going to go to g5 anyhow and give itself up just to open up this h-file eventually. You know, if knight g5, if the bishop captures, pawn recaptures, and again, half open h-file to work with. So we have b5. I guess that's just allowing that bishop to show itself, maybe b7, a6, but it seems like it's a little bit too slow. It is securing this knight's position as well. We have bishop back at this point. Vacating d3 for the queen, white is looking for mate on h7. So anticipating that, we have black trying to shut down the pressure along this diagonal with f5. White does best to make sure the position remains open with e takes f en passant, and after the recapture with the pawn, making sure that there is not going to be any knight move to either e5 or g5. We now have rook to e1, pressure on e6. Queen d6 to defend, and actually at this point there is an interesting sacrifice which was not played. In the game we saw knight to h2, but instead of that there is this really interesting sequence of moves, starting first with, again, bishop takes on h7. Not the first time we're seeing this possibility show itself, so beware if you are maybe playing the French defense. This will certainly be a possibility in many instances. So from here, if we have king takes bishop, an additional sacrifice with knight to g5, landing a check, and after pawn takes knight, the queen is now able to show herself. King g7, queen check, king in the corner, and knight to h5 in this position right here, looking for mate on g7. Not really a convenient way to defend against that. Moving the rook would allow mate, and the rook would just be taken if it went to that f7 square. So really black is now forced to give back material with bishop f6. The knight captures, and again, mate is being threatened. The queen can't even defend in that way because of check followed by mate, and so black will have to give back even more material with rook takes knight, and white is going to just be winning in this position. So we don't have that in the game. That was maybe a missed opportunity, but maybe there were also some other factors that went on in this game. Certainly it is shorter time controls, rapid time controls, and I'm not quite sure what the time situation was, so maybe that played a role into the move decision. So we have knight to h2, looking to pivot on g4. You'll note that these minor pieces, of these four, there really isn't going to be a better placement for, let's say, the light square bishop, dark square bishop, or that f4 knight, although I guess I could see that knight going to h5. But certainly the one on f3 is maybe the one who could use a little bit more work. And in fact, in chess, once you have developed your pieces and you're in that middle game stage, a good question to ask yourself is, how can I maybe improve the positioning of one of my pieces? And in this case, white is seeing that the knight on f6 can use some work. So knight to h4, rook f7, looking for some lateral defense. h7, g7 squares now protected. Knight g4, looking for a fork on h6, and this is where black goes completely wrong. Moving the king to h8, just looking to meet a knight move, a knight on h6 with just, let's say, rook g7 or rook f8, but neither of those moves actually turns out good. So the best defense is actually to just play bishop back to f8, watching over h6, getting ready to just take that knight if it were to go there. Certainly that wouldn't happen, but bishop f8 is the best defense in this position, but black just goes astray. After king h8, we have knight h6, and this rook is all of a sudden starting to run out of good moves. If it goes to f8, and an additional instance here where bishop takes on h7 shows itself. If king takes bishop, queen out to h5, with the discovered check in the air, this king is going to be dead. So instead of rook to f8 in this position, we have rook g7, and now the other knight, very aesthetic looking position. Both knights on the rim aren't necessarily grim in this position. These bishops backing up the position very well. A ton of squares really just being controlled on the black side, and there is no good defense at this point. In fact, the rook is now trapped. So black just trying to finally get this bishop involved in addition to this rook, but it's too little too late. After knight takes rook, king takes knight, the queen comes out looking for mate in 2, starting first with queen f7 and then queen g8. Black defends against this idea with bishop e6, knight check, bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, and black resigns, and for very good reason. The pressure on h7 is very telling. There is no convenient way to defend against it. If the rook plays to h8, we could just see bishop check, and after king g8, queen check, and, well, actually, something even better than that I'm just noticing right now. There's queen check on e8, bishop block, and a really nice finish, actually. Queen to e6. A really, really nice finish with these two bishops delivering checkmate. I guess you would have your pick of the litter right here. You could play your queen or bishop to that e6 square. So this is something I'm just coming up with right now. So this would just lead to mate. In other words, after rook to h8, we would have a mate in 1, 2, 3, and then 4. But as it was in this game, as this finished up, after bishop takes bishop, black ends up resigning. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.